All right, this is the talk I gave at the amazing meeting. The talk before my talk was given, well, I should point out, this was a series, one of a series of 5 talks about Martin Gardner, okay? Randy is a lifelong friend of Martin Gardner, and I guess he made it known that he'd like to have a session on Martin Gardner. And to a certain extent, that's what we had. We had about 5 talks about it. The talk before me was by Cole McCauley, who spoke to this group about a year and a half ago. So, since I followed him by 5 minutes, following him by a year and a half won't be a big deal. All right, so I tried very hard at that time, this summer, to not duplicate anything he said, and I'll try again today to do that. I will be assuming that you all know who Martin Gardner is and why he's the subject of a talk at a meeting like this, but it'll become more and more apparent as we go along. If you're not the fan of Martin Gardner, you should be. All right. So, very brief biography. Like I said, I've been working on his biography now. I've been working on his bibliography since 1979, and it runs now to about 350 pages. He was a very prolific person, but I've been working on his biography for about half that time. I have very little to show for it except for a huge amount of facts. All right. Now, but this is a very brief biography, just so we can do a context, because I'm going to be focusing on Gardner's early life, how he came to be the skeptic that he was. I'm not going to repeat for you all of the books he wrote and all that kind of stuff. All right, so started out in Tulsa until 32 when he graduated from high school. Went to the University of Chicago, where he wanted to major in science. Was told that instead he first actually wanted to go to Caltech, but he ended up going to the University of Chicago for a variety of reasons. And after he got to Chicago, he found that philosophy was a lot more exciting than science to him, and so he became a philosophy major. Graduated in 1937 after 1 year of graduate school. Most people don't know that 1 year of graduate school was in the seminary. All right. Took various jobs, which I won't repeat to you again because I want to get forward, so to speak. But he did spend 4 years in the Navy. And when he got out, he went back to Chicago, took a few more courses from some very famous philosophers like Carnap. And then he did some freelance writing and then discovered you could be a more successful freelance writer in New York, moved there until about 1952, at which point he started to get some paychecks from doing some magazine editing and so forth. But for most of his life, he's really been nothing more than a freelance writer. And if you asked him what his job was, he would always answer journalist. Okay? He did not, even though he wrote about mathematics for Scientific American for 25 years, he never took a math course in college. Took very little science in college, but he took a lot of philosophy of science. So that's his basic entry point to all this, is philosophy of science. As I already said, he attended to attend Caltech. When he was in high school, I don't know about his philosophy before high school, but actually I do have a quote from before high school. He says, "I attended grades 1 through 6 at Lee School in Tulsa. I had 2 teachers. One was an attractive young blonde who knew her science well. I remember being surprised when she told the class that the stalactites and stalagmites in the Carlsbad Caverns proved that the Earth was younger." This is 1920s now, early 1920s. "Stalagmites in Carlsbad Caverns proved the Earth was much older than 10,000 years of Genesis. In those days, public school teachers, even more than now, were afraid to talk about the biblical historical accuracy." So he went to an interesting set of schools. His high school was an unusual school in the Midwest at that time, because there was so much money in Tulsa, because it was the oil capital of the world. There was so much money there that almost everybody in this high school where teachers had MSs or PhDs. So he had an unusually strong academic background, okay, more than you would expect from somebody from Tulsa in the 1920s. All right. In high school, I don't know what before that, but in high school, he was reading the free thought literature, okay? And So he was an atheist. He would talk about how he was, when he had to do the, I think the various pronouncements he had to make, he stood up and did not make them in class as an objector. So he was fairly conscientiously atheistic at this time. But then before he graduated high school, he was a full-blown fundamentalist. Okay? Full-blown fundamentalist, okay? And he almost became an Adventist. He attended Adventist church for a year, but never actually joined it. Now, his mother was quite religious, belonged to the big Baptist church in town. His father was not. His father was a pantheist, as he self-described, but had no vocal attitude. He did whatever his wife said, and it was a very nice. I mean, Gardner said that religion was never discussed in their household, never discussed, never argued about for sure. Okay, now his father had a Ph.D. in geology from around 1905 from the George Washington University, and he was quite the scientist and quite the outdoorsman too. He would get on his horseback and do geology in the middle of nowhere. So he encouraged a love of science, which is why he wanted to go to Caltech, love of nature, erudition, and common sense. But again, nothing was said from his father about religion. In fact, he remembers taunting his father once by saying, "It's not the age of the rocks, but the rock of ages." So, just to make sure we understand that his father wasn't silent, this is a very interesting article in 1923 from the Tulsa Tribune, where his father addressed the Rotary Club and told him that evolution was correct and first chapter of Genesis was bogus. Okay? So, now, his father, of course, knew if he was going to stay in the Rotary Club, he would have to say things like, divine visitation, which of course is when God gave man a soul, I suppose. And he expressed a firm belief in miracles, none of which was true. But still, imagine 1923, scope trial, right? So he's standing up in front of the Rotary Club saying this. So he came from a background which was not a sheltering background in that sense. This is the oldest thing I could find he wrote. He said he wrote this in high school. That's a later hand. This is about physiognomy. It's not terribly pseudoscientific, but it is a borderline pseudoscientific thing. Now, when he was in high school, he was enthralled by Gernsback. Now, there's probably a lot of people today who don't remember Gernsback, but Hugo Gernsback had a publication empire, and he was a very strong person in the early popularization of science and also popularization of science fiction, both. And so he had this magazine called Science and Invention. Now, Gardner liked this magazine so much, of course, that he read it every month when it came out. But on top of that, in his dotage, Gardner went out and bought an entire set of these to read them again. Okay? In fact, he wanted to put out a book about this, but he couldn't find a publisher interested in doing that. In any event, an example is Dunninger. Dunninger was a famous magician at the time who was skeptical. And as this quote down here from Gardner says, yes, he was sort of the Randy of his day. Okay, so Dunninger would have a regular column in Science and Invention, usually about magic, but also talking about more skeptical things as well. So, now it says up there, this is the golden age, and they had golden covers. Now, this may not be helpful here, so I'll show you a golden cover. Okay, the magazine originally had these golden covers because it was the golden age of science. And so you can see some of the things they had, like Can the Dead Be Reunited? And an article about astrology. Okay, these were cover stories. These weren't hidden in the back. A fake radio doctor, and Science Checks the Spirit Medium, and so forth. So he avidly read this magazine in the 20s. Okay, he just could not wait for each issue to arrive. So he was obviously exposed to this and obviously quite interested in this. So this was an early influence, to say the least. He saw Houdini in about 1928, I believe. I couldn't get the exact date. I probably could go through the old newspapers and find out when he visited Tulsa. But this was the time when Houdini's tours involved 1/3 magic, 1/3 escape, and 1/3 an attack on spiritualism. Okay, because he put it in his act. It was quite quite a popular thing for people to come and hear him talk and explain how spiritualists deceived them. Okay, and so he certainly had that first-hand contact with it, and even before that he would have known about this because Houdini at that time was the editor or the head of the Society of American Magicians and the editor of the Sphinx magazine. Gardner himself published in the Sphinx magazine in 1930. That was his first publication. So when he published in the Sphinx magazine, perhaps again, some of you know this, but others don't, he had a lifelong interest, Gardner did, in magic. He was I would like to say a practicing magician, which is deceptive because he never performed in public in his entire life. He never performed magic. However, he wrote continuously about magic, and I would think, perhaps with maybe 1 or 2 years exception, every year from 1930 to 2010, he published in a magic journal. Okay, he had a long and continuous interest in magic. He was one of these people who created tricks for other people. Okay, so he had this deep interest in magic, and if you asked him about that, he would give you different answers at different times, but one of the answers he said is that it helps people appreciate science more when they understand wondrous things have explanations. And that was one of his reasons for doing magic. Now, we go to the University of Chicago. He arrived as a fundamentalist. He did not change immediately. He often oversimplified this in interviews. He did not change from being a fundamentalist immediately at arriving. In fact, he continued that way. In fact, he formed Christian societies at University of Chicago. He spent, as I already told you, he spent 1 year in seminary. Now, the reason he went to seminary, though, you have to understand, is not because he had any interest in being a theologian. He only went there because he had questions for which he wanted answers. And he thought he could get the answers to his own questions by studying this. In other interviews, people asked why did he study philosophy, and he repeated what he actually said to his philosophy teacher in class, because the teacher was asking everybody in the class, why are you here? And he said that it's because he was not taking philosophy because it was a subject he was interested in. He said, I'm taking philosophy because I want to know what I believe. He had a deep, troubling feeling that he didn't know why he believed what he believed, and he wanted to know why. This dominated his whole life. If you go into his library late in life, he would have like 10,000 books, maybe I exaggerate, 5,000 books on philosophy. And you open up any one of them, and you'll see it's copiously underlined. And there would be notes in the end papers saying what was interesting in that book. He spent his entire life studying the philosophy of science and so forth to understand why people believe what they did. And he ended up discovering most of the reasons were bogus. Okay? The philosophical reasons were bogus. He concluded most philosophers were wrong. Okay? And in fact, somebody asked him, why did he think, this was actually when he was graduating from college and he was taking his Phi Beta Kappa interview, which he got. He said, somebody asked him, what's your favorite philosopher? And he said, it was Bertrand Russell. And they said, why Bertrand Russell? He said, Bertrand Russell is the only philosopher, to his knowledge, that ever changed his mind. So that had a great impression on him. All right, but he had this deep, ongoing through his life, desire to understand why people believe things and why he should believe this instead of believing that. The most disenchanting course I took in Chicago was Geology 101. Okay? Now, he says this in many interviews because he could tell after taking geology that George McCready Price, who he believed entirely when he went to college, he thought George McCready's idea of biblical geology was very convincing. And when he took a real geology course, he realized that Price was ridiculous. Okay? And so he had no trouble throwing over Price. Okay? It's not like he clung to it. He threw it over. Now, of course, he wanted to know what to replace it by, but he threw it over without any trouble. Okay, that did not immediately disillusion him from being a Christian, but it did throw it over. All right. Now, I was going through my disenchantment phase, which is when I no longer believed in the Bible as a revelation. All right, so the point is that as he went through his 4 years of college, he did eventually when he graduated, was no longer what he would describe as a Christian. Even if he attended Christian meetings, he knew that he was no longer a Christian. He knew that he did not believe in the central tenets of Christianity. He did not believe in the resurrection of Christ. He did not believe in this. He did not believe in that. Those things he had already discarded. And he, throughout his entire life, was extremely angry with anybody who called themselves a Christian who didn't believe these things. Now, he, in fact, even in his 80s, would say, I'm probably a better Christian than most people go to church, okay? Because he knew more about the Bible, he behaved correctly, but he just didn't believe in these things. And he realized actually most Christians don't either, but they still go to church. So that's what I mean by the disenchantment phase. He did not become a vocal atheist. In fact, he did not become an atheist at all. All right? But he did continue to study. Now, if you read his book, The Flight of Peter From, it's a fictional book, but if you read it, the protagonist starts off being a fundamentalist and goes from philosopher to philosopher, like from Barth to Tillich to so forth, goes through all of these different religious, or should say theologians, and because each one believed less and less. And so he was trying to find somebody who could instruct him on what to believe, until eventually he discovered none of them were going to fill the bill. All right, so by the time he by the time he entered seminary, he no longer believed in any of those things. All right, now, but he still had questions, and he was still looking for answers. All right, so it was no day, there was no event, there was no epiphany where he said, I should stop believing in religion and so forth. It was a slow, gradual disintegration, and there was no single event. Now, it's important to realize that from this point till the day he died, he described himself as a philosophical theist, because he did continue to believe in God. Okay? People would write to him and say, because you're an atheist, blah, 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 and he'd write back and say, and then at the end he'd say, oh, by the way, I'm not an atheist. All right. So he was an atheist, he was a philosophical theist. He continued to believe in God. He tended to believe in prayer. He tended to believe in the afterlife. Okay? He freely confessed that he had no idea why any of those things should be something he could believe in. He freely confessed that the atheists had the better arguments. Freely confessed that. He just didn't feel the atheists had arguments that would make his stance indefensible. And his stance was that if anything conflicted with a religious belief, the religious belief should be jettisoned. Right? If some science conflicted with religion, that religious belief should be jettisoned. But if it doesn't conflict with the religious belief, he saw no reason to jettison it. He didn't have this Occam's razor where you would throw away God because it didn't seem to be doing very much for you after a while. All right? He just felt that. Carl Sagan wrote to him and he said, I think I finally figured out what's going on. He said, you believe in God because it makes you feel good. And he wrote back to Carl Sagan, yes, you finally understand it. It's just that simple. Now, going back some years to 1933. Now, as I said, he flirted with Adventism in high school. But clearly, because of the geology already, he was beginning to have doubts. Again, there was no clear disintegration. But the first thing he abandoned was Adventism. All right? And so he didn't just abandon it. He was in correspondence with the Ellen White estate. Okay? Now, this is like a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, writing to that saying, I read this and it doesn't make any sense. And they're writing back saying, oh, no, you have to believe it. It's all right. But the point is that he's taking them on in 1933. Okay, he went to school in the fall of 1932. Okay? So he's a very proactive person in trying to find out what to believe. He's not just sitting around. So are you with me? And then this next one, later in 1933, November 24th, he wrote on it, the fairness of these replies is an indication of the subtlety by which cults are rationalized and thereby sustained. Refutation of a cult is impossible. Okay? So this is 1933. This is a very early revelation that he came to from dealing with the Ellen White estate. Is everybody clear on this? So this is but he was not giving up religion at this point. Okay, that took several more years. But he's very active trying to find out what should be believed and what can be thrown away. Now this appeared in a magazine called Revelation magazine. It was a letter to the editor, 1934. It's signed a student from the University of Chicago. I know he wrote it because he admitted to it. Now, and now this would be sort of an ancient history thing. This is how he became a Christian, not the Disillusioned, but this is the prehistory where he became a Christian. And he explains that it didn't happen all at once. Again, he was reading the free thought literature, and he just started talking to more people who were religious, and apparently his conversion was very slow. And in fact, he says down here lower, I wasn't even sure I was a Christian until I read a tract from the Moody Cole Porridge tracts, which are this Moody Church is this big church in Chicago. Okay, and they had thousands of tracts they would sell to you by mail. Okay, and so only after reading the tract did he realize he had already been raptured. All right, so for him it was a very gradual process, and somebody had to tell him that he had done that. But the point still is that this was a testimonial. It was presumably something he was asked to write to prove his fealty, was to put testimonials like this in the popular press. Well, this same magazine, a little bit later, just in case you think he was forced to do it, he put his name on this one. All right, now, and when I told him I found this actually, it's hard to find this magazine. I found it in the Princeton Theological Seminary library. When I found this article and I mailed it to him, he refused to read it. Okay, he is so completely disgusted and disavowed by this that he wasn't even going to read it and tell me what his thoughts were. Okay, that doesn't alter the fact from a biographer's viewpoint, he wrote it. All right? I mean, a biographer, I have to acknowledge he wrote it. I can't, whitewash anything. And so this is basically telling students, be sure you are saved before you go to college. All right, basically. Because he says when you get to college, it's all over. Okay, your any weak religious beliefs you had when you went to college will be destroyed. And in fact, he starts off by telling about his roommate who would kneel by his bed every night and pray with him, but at the second year was no longer really a Christian anymore, and he was very alarmed by that. And since he wrote this actually it's a fairly long article, and so again, he completely disavowed this, and he probably would have disavowed it even a year later. And he also believes the editor of the magazine probably spiced it up a little bit. But I don't know how he can say that because he refused to read it. All right. In any event. Other early things he wrote. He was, like I said, a journalist, and he was also a journalist in college. He worked with the Daily Maroon and so forth. This is a letter that appeared in the Daily Maroon. This is on a non-religious subject. He's saying here that you were not, I guess I can read it up here as easily as down here. You were not permitted to say one culture was better than another. So what he's talking about now is cultural relativism in the anthropology department. Okay? The anthropology department was dominated by cultural relativists. In fact, I think 100% of them were. Okay? Cultural relativism was the antidote to naive anthropology 20, 30 years earlier. Okay? So, anthropologists had said some pretty stupid things about these cultures, and then the cultural relativism school said, no, you can't make those sorts of assessments. Every culture is as good as every other culture, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you can't say this is better than that, and so forth. And he's saying, I think it is proper to say culture A is meeting the needs of its people better than culture B. This was Dewey's viewpoint. Dewey's one of his heroes. Okay, so this is a early thing, and you notice here it says, everything is in the folkways was the phrase that people used in cultural relativism. Okay? Now, he wrote about this on a couple of occasions, but I just want to jump forward to 1950 and come back to 1934 in a second. But in 1950, he wrote this article, Mathematics and the Folkways. And it was a response, it was to a book written by this Alvin White about that mathematics is a complete human invention. It is, therefore, cultural relativism should be applied. No mathematics is better than any other mathematics. Okay? And Gardner was pretty upset about this, okay, because he knew a lot about mathematics, even though he was not a mathematician. So the idea that any mathematics is as good as any other, and if in your culture 2 + 2 = 5, that's okay. All right? He said it's not okay. Okay? So it seems sort of obvious to us, but there is a certain, for people who aren't, people here who aren't acquainted with the history of mathematics, mathematics is a human invention. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's an axiomatic mathematics is based on some arbitrarily chosen axioms. Okay, that's true, but that's a trivial statement. Okay, but that doesn't alter the fact that 2 + 2 is always going to be equal to 4 in all cultures. Okay, and so he was confusing these different things and putting together an argument, and Gardner tried to dismantle the argument here. Okay, so and I think it's also nice that he puts in a little understanding of Lewis Carroll here in 1950. Of course, 1960 is when he did his annotated Alice. So that was, and he wrote more than one article about cultural relativism, but this is probably the easiest one for me to point you to. Okay? Now, if you know, in 1950, he also wrote another article called Hermit Scientists. So I think this is an interesting book, interesting article because it's titled Hermit Scholars. Okay? So it sort of has a foreshadowing of the later Hermit Scientists. And this article was about two types of scholars, the professors and students. So scholars applies to both in this. One was an attack on professors who isolated themselves, but more to the point, it was on students who believed what they were told. Okay? So he's in a college and he's surrounded by, professors teaching people things. And I guess because of his annoyance with cultural relativism, he was getting a little annoyed by everybody just copying down what the professor said and never asking any questions. I mean, after all, remember, the reason he was in philosophy is he was asking questions. He wanted real answers to real questions. And he wasn't interested in just writing down what the professor said and taking tests. Now, by the way, taking tests was a minor thing at Chicago at that time. If you don't know, at this time, it was called the Hutchins era at the University of Chicago. University of Chicago was different from every other university in the country. Okay? It was, I can give a whole hour lecture on the University of Chicago in the 1930s. Okay, there's a lot to be said about it, but it was different from all other countries. So the fact that he was there was sort of interesting because at that time you could pretty much do anything you wanted. You didn't have to attend class. You could walk into any class you want any time and just sit down. You could take a test for a course that you never attended. Okay, there's lots of things you could just do. It was a much more free format learning environment than we have seen since. Of course, a lot of people who can tell you a lot of bad things about it as well. But that's beside the point. The point is that he was very worried about people, including his fellow students, who were not asking enough questions. And he was writing about it. And he wrote this article in 1936, Skepticism and Ray Ellenwood. I don't want to get into who Ray Ellenwood and what he said, but the interesting quote from this article was, I only wish to point out that a novice cannot choose with certainty between disagreeing experts. And Ray Ellenwood said everybody should be skeptical and should believe the experts, which is not what he believed. Okay, so, because as he just finished saying, what experts should you believe? Okay, and so again, he's very much into doing your own research, going out, trying to understand what's going on. Just because somebody has a mortarboard on his head doesn't mean you have to believe them. Okay? So he had that kind of skeptical attitude himself. This article, also written in the same period, again, these are all for the Daily Maroon, though they who think they think should think again. All right. The relevant quote from this is given there. American collegiates were once characterized by the statement that they preferred being told what to think to being told to think. And students who are told what to think are too often the students who think they do the most thinking. All right, so it's a hard sentence to utter, but you can get the point. The point is that he was becoming very disillusioned with the skeptical attitude towards scholarship of his fellow students. 1935, another influence in Gardner's skeptical journey was the Targ's bookstore. Now, everybody probably has heard of Russell Targ because of his SRI influences over the years. His father owned a bookstore in Chicago at this time. Very interesting bookstore, a lot of interesting volumes that you didn't see in other bookstores. It's quite a destination for people who were scholarly. He says that I went there quite often and had a big section on parapsychology, okay? And so he was going to Targ's bookstore, he was buying books on parapsychology at the time, okay? And again, you remember all these other things. It's almost like I'm telling the story of 2 or 3 people instead of one person, because he's doing all of these things simultaneously, okay? So he would be getting these books, reading them. Now, by the way, he didn't keep them. Famously, Gardner would take his books home and cut them up and put them on index cards, okay? The index cards still exist. There are tens of thousands of them in card cabinets in his son's garage, okay? But he had this enormous collection of index cards on all possible subjects. And say, I like to liken it to like doing a Google search, okay? And that day, how did you find something? Well, you could just go to Gardner and he'd open his files and he'd give you the answer. He had an enormous number of these. Okay, so the point is that he would get the books, not necessarily keep them, but rip them up. And also, a friend of his came in and said, isn't that the first edition of Great Gatsby? Yeah. So, it's true. All right. But he had Conan Doyle, and I have a special interest in Conan Doyle because I'm a Sherlockian. All right. But Conan Doyle, of course, had written about spirit photography and a lot of other weird things because he converted to spiritualism in 1914. And Gardner was very much aware of Conan Doyle's involvement at that time. And he thought he was a crank, and so on and so forth. So the point is that he was spending time reading these books, clipping them, understanding them. He had this understanding of pseudoscience, spiritualism, and other things happening at that time. Okay? It's not something he came to late in life. Okay? And the last quote is, I became convinced by studying what is wrong about a crank as you learn a lot more about the subject. And that probably had a lot to do with the success of his later column in Skeptical Inquirer. Now here's a college note card, again in that file cabinet. And he was explaining to himself why he could ignore spiritualism. I know it's unreadable, and I was trying to read it now, but it's basically saying, it says, that assuming that there is no basis for it, why would this have occurred? And then he would say the phenomenon is based upon psychological aberrations, it's based upon coincidences, it's based upon trickery, and it's based upon poorly designed experiments. So he's already thinking through this. In fact, there's lots of cards in there that explain why I should believe this, and these are valuable things for a biographer to have, because he would write down why he believed something, just so he wouldn't have to think of it a second time, I guess. So this is an early thing from the college days about his interest in spiritualism. He again was constantly in magic circles his entire life, and so he would be aware of this and other similar things. Now, Anneman is a famous magician at the time, especially because he published this magazine called The Jinx. The title you can read. And so the magicians at the time were obviously aware of how Professor Rhine's experiments at Duke University were being gamed. Okay, and so they knew how it was being gamed, and they were writing about it as well. Okay, and so he was aware of this, and to him this was a commonplace thing. Okay, since magicians already knew how all these things were being done, he wasn't the least bit impressed by Professor Rhine and all these other people. Again, he was a magician he was a publishing magician from 1930. He knew everything. He had every book on magic you could buy. His father was rich. Okay, his father was rich. He had all the books he wanted on magic. Now, Gardner himself, since I introduced that, I guess I should come clean. His father was rich and bought him everything he wanted. There's no doubt about that. But when he went to college and the Depression occurred, and he was in Chicago where the Depression was especially bad, he actually revolted in the sense that he lived a pauper's life. after about 1934, 1935. He led a pauper's life. He would live in an unfurnished room with a orange crate and a typewriter and a clock, and that was all his possessions. In addition to the boxes of cards and ladies' shoe boxes in his closet. I mean, it's sort of strange. I mean, he, from until like 1955, he had an austere life. Okay, that's not part of this story. I'm just putting it in because I want to counterbalance it against the previous comment. Yes?
Did he have plans for the cards? Did he have something that he was ultimately going to do, or was he really just building his own Google so he could go back and refresh what he had been thinking?
He always planned to be a writer. Okay, not necessarily a journalist. He may not know what that meant. He might have thought it was going to be a scholar, and in an academic setting, perhaps. I don't know. But it became very clear before the 1940 he was never going to be an academic. Okay, but the point still is that it was all preparation for writing. Okay. He was disillusioned. This is obviously a side tangent, but it's not that far off the track of what I'm trying to say here. In the 1930s, he was a fellow traveler, no doubt about it. He freely confesses to being a fellow traveler in the 1930s. In fact, a lot of college students were fellow travelers in the 1930s. He's also fairly proud of the fact that he never joined the Communist Party, okay? Even though he was constantly being entreated because he was recognized on campus as a fairly important thinker at that time, and if they could get him into the Communist Party, a lot of people would follow. But he wouldn't join. But he was a fellow traveler. He really did believe in what was going on in Russia was an interesting and important experiment. And it's hard for us to believe in this time how little truth about Russia got out. Okay? It is hard for us to believe because it's so obvious from our lens that everybody should have been aware that Russia was a disaster, okay, at this time. But nothing. In fact, we would send people over there and they would come back with pictures of dancing Russian girls. And that's what they would publish, not anything about these pogroms and so forth. So eventually he read Kessler. Kessler was one of the first people who wrote, this is around 1940, who wrote honestly about what was happening in Russia, and he was completely disillusioned because he believed Kessler. Okay, it's like taking geology to disbelieve Price. Okay, he read Kessler, and then suddenly he had to disbelieve a lot of things he had built up this belief about. Okay, and so he renounced it. And he also says that the communists were, in some sense, crackpots, just the same as creative race was a crackpot. In other words, the labor theory is a crackpot notion. Okay, so he understood economics through the lens of a skeptic as well, and he was very disillusioned, and he had to renounce beliefs. Like earlier, he had to renounce Christian beliefs. Okay, and he had to decide what he was going to believe and what he wasn't going to believe. I can tell you right now, he did become a democratic socialist. He was the Bernie Sanders of his time. Okay, he worked with the Democratic Socialist Party from like 1950 onward. Okay, so he was definitely a democratic socialist. Okay, so he retained that belief. It's like giving up on Christianity but becoming a philosophical theist. He retained what it was that he thought was important in the original belief and had to jettison everything else. Okay, and so that was, again, slightly aside, but I believe part of the story. Now, back to Chicago. This is after the war. There's very little to tell you about during the war years. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in his life, but not relative to this story. Now, he was taking courses from Carnap. Just to show how important his relationship with Carnap was, is that after a while, he arranged with Carnap's wife to tape record his lectures in a course for undergraduates. Okay, not his graduate course, but his undergraduate course, which was an introduction to the philosophy of science. And had his wife tape record these, and he would transcribe them into sheets, and then he would rewrite them in a way that normal Americans could understand it, and it was published under Carnap's name, not under Gardner's name. Okay, so even though Carnap gave the lectures, Gardner wrote the book. But regardless, so there's a book out there now called I just had two or three titles, so I don't know what it's called now, but Carnap book, Introduction to the Philosophy of Science, that was a book Gardner wrote. So this illustrates how closely his relationship was with Carnap. Okay, now you all know about Carnap and Popper and so forth. I'm not going to repeat those chapters in the philosophy of science for you. Okay, but just to say that he was a student of Carnap, and literally. All right, so in 1950, he published a paper that he had written as a school assignment, a class assignment for Carnap, and that was Order and Surprise. So the paper Order and Surprise was something he had written as a class assignment for Carnap. Apparently, he revised it a couple of years later and published it in a philosophical magazine, and later it appeared in a book in the same title. Okay? In this article, Order and Surprise, he establishes his Mysterian roots and distances himself from dogmatic scientism. And that, what do I mean by that? Well, it's sort of interesting. I have to be careful here because at this meeting last summer, the TAM, the person who came after me defined the Mysterian philosophy differently than I define it. Okay, he had a very, very narrow take on it, and I have a more broad take on it. Okay, so it's possible you'll get Mysterian, by the way, is not a word you'll see in any dictionary. Okay, people who are Mysterians are self-identified as Mysterians. Okay, and so I guess if you're self-identified, you can say the word means anything you want. All right, so let me explain what Gardner meant by the word Mysterian. And there's a lot of Mysterians out there. Noam Chomsky and all these people are card-carrying Mysterians. Now, so the idea behind being a Mysterian is that you completely subscribe to the enterprise of science. You don't question that at all. How science is done, how science advances knowledge, all of this, you believe. You have great confidence in science to answer questions. What you don't have confidence in is science answering all questions. That's what it means to be a Mysterian. You don't want to interfere with anybody's research programs because all of those are valuable, but there are certain things that you believe will persist in being mysterious. And another way of saying it is, research just pushes back the frontiers of mystery. Once you've solved some problem, new problems arise, some things. And he, when asked what those problems might be, he's quite clear. The problems are consciousness and free will, for which he thought those were two names for the same thing. Okay, in fact, he spent a great deal of his life trying to tease those apart, and he said he couldn't. He said those were two names for the same thing, free will and consciousness. And he thinks those will persist in being mysterious to us. Okay, all sorts of brain science and all, friends of his like Hofstadter, who wrote that book, I Am a Strange Loop. He wrote a scathing review of his friend's book, saying that this is not garbage. You can't use this sort of approach to answer these deep questions. Okay, so it's not a dogmatic scientism. Again, if you think dogmatic scientism is something that science will answer all questions, it distances him from that, but does not distance him from anything to do with the enterprise of science. Another thing on this journey, 1948. In case you're curious, we're leading up to 1952. That's the climax of this talk. All right. So I'm trying to get all this stuff in a row here. In 1940, he wrote an article for Extensions. It's called It's Smart to be Fooled. And this he wrote for the general public about how smart people are easily fooled, something that we're all aware of today in this group, right? I mean, that's one of the problems, is so easy to fool smart people. Well, again, he first wrote about it in 1948. He discusses magic and carnival gaffes, and of course Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a very smart person who was easily fooled, and so on and so forth. So he's aware of this. He's out there writing about it for the general public. Okay, I already told you about his reason for liking Bertrand Russell as a college student, but when he read The Outline of Intellectual Rubbish by Russell, which I own and I suppose all of you should own, it's a great book. It's only like 30 pages long. It's easy to read. He wrote this book, and he was very influenced by it. Okay, that this is something this should be writing about, should be talking to the public about. Even though he wasn't surprised by anything in the book, is the outlook of being an apologist for this is what impressed him. An example of that is a review he wrote for the New Leader of a book called The Religious Revolt Against Reason. I don't want to go into it, but it's just one of the several things he was writing at that time about this attitude and skeptical attitude in putting it out in front of the public. I thought this was an interesting article in 1950. As a result of articles like I just put up one of them just a moment ago, as a result of these, J.B. Rhine wrote to him in 1950 saying, I really like your stuff. Okay? So I mean, he was already writing to J.B. Rhine at this point. All right? Of course, he didn't. He already had a negative attitude, J.B. Rhine. But it is interesting that Rhine is like many of those people who in this realm who think these people are crazy, but I'm not crazy. Okay? And this is a letter supporting that.
He was sort of inviting Gardner to have a shot at it, actually.
Well,
He doesn't realize that.
yes and no. When he wrote his book, In the Name of Science, he sent the chapter to Rhine, and Rhine responded by saying, I like your chapter. So he gave Rhine full view of what he was going to say about him. Now, the article that led to the famous book, In the Name of Science, it was the article Hermit Scientist, published in 1950. And I asked him why he wrote it, and he said, I don't recall. Now, Gardner was very forthcoming. You could ask him anything, but when he says, I don't recall, you could not distinguish between whether he actually couldn't remember or he just wasn't going to tell you. All right? So he would say this a lot, and so I have to go, this makes the biography a little bit harder, because you don't want to put words in his mouth, but you also want to paint a full portrait. Martin Gardner, as you know, never spoke in public. Maybe you don't know. Gardner never spoke in public once. Okay? He never gave a lecture to anybody anytime. Okay? He was an incredibly shy person. Incredibly shy person. But if you met him one-on-one, he was very forthcoming. Okay? Occasionally he might say, I don't recall, but he would answer your questions. And he wasn't evasive. He really wasn't. And so I thank him for that. But he was incredibly shy. And so you have to go to him and you have to ask him a direct question. Okay? And he'll answer it. But he's not going to volunteer too much in a public realm. Not to say he hasn't written a lot of articles that describe his own beliefs. In fact, he wrote an entire book, in case you're curious. The Whys of a Philosophical Scrivener is a book you should all own. It's a book that in which it's what he calls it a confessional, okay, where he actually explains why he believes everything he believes. Okay, so he's not evasive about that. Okay, but if I were to ask him instead, what was your relationship with women in college? It would be, I don't recall. All right. So I just don't know. So especially some women he kept naming over and over again. All right. Now, when he wrote this article, he was researching a book on hoaxes. In fact, we have the draft perspective of the book on hoaxes. Okay, he was very interested in hoaxes, but because this comes more from his magic background as much as anything else. Okay, in the magic background, because he knew how these hoaxes occurred. But actually, there were already a lot of books about hoaxes in print at that time. This would not have been a new subject. So what he did instead is he took John Eliot's advice, his agent, and he geared it towards pseudoscience. So he first wrote the Antioch Review and then took that and expanded it into a book. Okay? So it wasn't that he had this long-term goal of writing about pseudoscience. It was just this. Other things happening to him at this time. We know he attended this conference of science fiction in 1952 because he's listed as an attendee. And I thought it was very interesting that at this conference in 52, there was actually a pseudoscience panel. It was called Pseudoscience Panel. Okay? And so that was interesting. And it was at the same conference there was another panel on flying saucers, which of course was quite new in 1952. All right? So he's surrounded by these people. He was very interested in science fiction at the time. In fact, he was writing a lot of science fiction at this time. And finally, we get to the book, 1952, In the Name of Science, later, of course, called Fads and Fallacies, when it was reprinted by Dover. All right? My particular cover is a little torn there. But in any event, this was a very impressive book. A great amount of research, almost all of it done at the New York Library, and writing to people, as we've seen evidence of. The book did not sell well. The book was remaindered. He later became friends with Fred Serker, who was the editor of Dover. Okay, in 1956, 55 or 56, Gardner had a book published by Dover about magic tricks, mathematical magic tricks. And so Serker asked him, do you have anything else? And he said, yeah, I have this book. And so Serker put it out in this. Now, what happened next is very famous. Two things happened. One is the Village Voice was giving out free copies of this book to everybody who subscribed to the Village Voice. Okay? He didn't have an in with the Village Voice, so it's not entirely clear why this happened. But he did, and so everybody got to hear a little more about it. But the real kicker was this Long John Nebel, who was a radio host at that time who liked to have flaky people on, and the flaky people would come on every night and say, I hate this Martin Gardner. And the sales took off. And so the book has been very much in print ever since. It is arguably the first book on pseudoscience, but I want to qualify that. It was certainly not the first book on pseudoscientific topics. There were many books before this on spiritualism. Houdini had written some, other people had written them. There was a lot of books about spiritualism in press. There were also many books about hoaxes in press. And there were many books on popular delusions, okay, which again, some of you probably have in your libraries at this time. So none of those, in fact, one of those was written by Burger Evans. Burger Evans' books are really wonderful if you haven't read them. He rewrote 2 books. But we know that Gardner knew about them because he actually reviewed one of those books in Saturday Review in 1954. Okay, so the point is that it wasn't the first book in pseudoscience in that respect, but it was the first book about science as it relates to pseudoscience, okay? Everything in the book was a scientific topic, and nobody else had really done this before. They were all interested in hoaxes that had nothing to do with science. Perhaps a scientific hoax, perhaps not, but he was the first person really to popularize this aspect, to bring it all together in one book, and in that respect, I think he does deserve credit for having the first book on pseudoscience, which remained in print till this day, very much so. Okay, and so it's hard to believe anybody becoming interested in being a skeptic who does not very quickly go out and read this book. It's hard to imagine. Here's an example of his correspondence at that time. George McCready Price wrote to him, and I highlighted here the interesting quote, "No, I did not expect your writing to take my side." All right, and so forth. So people often came to Gardner and said, you lied to them. You lied to these people you were writing about. You didn't tell them what you were going to write. Well, he sent the stuff to Rhine, right? And McCready Price, and he sent it to everybody and asked for their comments. Now, in his chapter on Rhine, he said, for example, either Rhine is a complete idiot or he's a genius. So Rhine, of course, understood what that meant and had nothing to say. How could he argue with that? All right? So, and similarly, he didn't, if you read the book carefully, very rarely does he ever come out and say anybody is a fool. He just presents the facts in such a way that you'd be kind of stupid yourself not to realize these people were fools, okay? But he doesn't attack anybody in the book. He just lays out the facts. And this is an example of his correspondence in that regard. Now here's a really obscure reference, 1952, Phooey on Nostradamus by Martin Gardner. Now, this article, such as it is, appears within a novel called Asylum Earth, which you can read if there was better light, you would see it was written by Bruce Eliot. Now, some of you might know who Bruce Eliot is. He's a famous magician from the 50s and 60s, famous for his get-togethers called the sodalities. And so he would have, all the magicians knew who this was, but he also wrote science fiction on the side. And he had seen a preprint of Gardner's book, because Gardner had showed it to him. And so as a favor to Gardner, he put this fake article by Gardner in his story. So he actually had nothing to do with this. Gardner had nothing to do with this, but it is an interesting reference for a bibliographer. All right. So what else did he do after 1952? Nothing. 1966, he wrote Dermo-Optical Perception, and in 1967, he wrote A Short But Wild History of Spirit Photography. Nothing until before 73. So it's not like this book was the beginning of a huge publishing campaign. It's not like he was starting a big movement and organizing people. Nothing like that. I mean, he did a great thing by writing the book, but he had other things to do. He had just had some children. He had to get paychecks. He had to work for Scientific American. He did that for 25 years. He annotated Alice. He did all these other things that took over his time, and he did not spearhead a movement. Now, before I get to what happened in 1953, I think this was a little interesting thing I thought I would like to point out. 1959, he wrote a letter to Dennis Flanagan about starting a magazine for science and the humanities. So this is actually what he wanted to do. He didn't want to start a magazine about science, pseudoscience. He thought what would be much more interesting is to write a magazine about science and the humanities, in which famous people would write articles about science for the general public, but more philosophical, more entertaining articles than what you would find in Scientific American. Okay, emphasis on the humanities side of this. And he thought this was going to be a great idea. He said, I was going to call it marginalia down there, and so on and so forth. Now, this was in 1959. You can sort of see how this was in his mind, because he was also working on the annotated Alice at the time. And he was becoming acquainted with all of these articles that in the Alice literature that talked about scientific things or mathematical things in a more humanities context. But this was one thing he wanted to do at that time. It never happened because Dennis Flanagan, who was the editor of Scientific American at that time, didn't buy it. Now we jump forward to 1974. This is a famous letter he wrote. He wrote it to an editor of a magazine who was going to publish one of his books, the editor of Crowell Publisher. And I should know who the person is. This is Bob, and I knew at one time who Bob was, but I've forgotten now. Okay, but he wrote to the editor and he said, I am withdrawing my contract from you. All right, because they had just published the book, Arrigo, Surgeon of the Rusty Knife. Okay, and Gardner was appalled by this. He was appalled by that a major publisher like Crowell would publish this book. And so he wrote this long letter basically saying that for the occult revolution, so that's what he was calling it at this time, in America is reaching awesome heights of insanity, heights paralleled only by the wave of occultism and pseudoscience that swept Nazi Germany. Okay? He was appalled by this thing. So we don't understand now what happened in the early 70s unless you have a good memory, because there really was this enormous bubble of an interest in the occult, more so than now, okay? Now it's more of a gradual thing, but there was a big bubble at that time. And he said, I'm not going to let you publish my book. As a protest to this, I'm going to withdraw my manuscript from you. Okay, so this is in 1974. So in the late 73, early 74, he became very exercised about this. He also was friends with James Randi at this time, and also very good friends with Ray Hyman. Okay, all three of these were magicians, and they knew each other as magicians, but they also knew each other because at this time Ray Hyman was going around the country giving lectures about skeptical thinking. Okay? And so Ray Hyman was was already involved in this on the educational side of things. And so Ray Hyman says to Randi and Gardner, we should form an educational society where we can get people to think straight. Okay? And now Randi wasn't big on the education, but he was on the exposing, debunking side of things. Now Ray Hyman didn't care about debunking, okay, but Randi did, and Gardner was trapped between these two personalities on how far to go in one direction or the other. And they talked, and because they didn't all agree on exactly what should be done, they agreed a society should exist and a magazine should be published, but they just couldn't decide. Actually, their group had different names in their correspondence. The one I liked was SIR, Sir. It was something like Sanity in Research. That's what it stood for. Okay, so that's what they called themselves for a little while, Sanity in Research. So they couldn't come together, and but they were all pretty much this, and they would talk to everybody. And of course, this is when Paul Kurtz arrived, because Paul Kurtz was already adept at publishing. Now, Paul Kurtz didn't agree with any one of these three people about much, but he did agree that it was all very interesting and that he could bring his expertise. Because he at least could form a group. He knew how to form a group. He knew how to publish a magazine. And so they got him on board. They also got Marcello Truzzi on board. So Marcello Truzzi was one of the 5 people involved. Fraser was a little down the road. He wasn't quite there yet. Okay, but the point is that these 5 people got together and they had this. Now, of course, we all know about, perhaps we don't all know. I have a separate talk about Marcello Truzzi. You can invite me back for that. I can give you the Marcello Truzzi talk. But the point is that Marcello Truzzi had a very different attitude. He was about as far from Randy on debunking as you could possibly be. He was even further to the right of, further away than Rayhyman. The point is that we all know what happened, of course, is that PsyCop formed as a result of Gardner's fomenting this, the other people joining in, saying something should be done, finding people who know how to do things, and then they formed PsyCop. Now, Gardner's most enduring contribution to PsyCop was his column, Notes on a Fringe Watcher, column, which went from 83 to 2002. Plus, there were 6 more random ones after 2002. These were collected in 5 books. In this same time period, he became very active in writing again, as opposed to before 73. He became very active in writing after 73, and maybe 60 articles of one type or another relative to this literature. And so he became very supportive. But again, my main purpose of this talk was to get us up to 1952, okay? And that's the end of my talk. Yes?
You said James Gardner, his father, attended George Washington University in Washington here. Is there any family history in this area?
Not at all. The family has history in Kentucky. Both his mother and his father have Kentucky roots.
My second question was, you described Martin Gardner as a democratic socialist.
Right.
Yet that letter we just saw to his publisher described himself as a libertarian. Now, how would you reconcile that?
All I can say is that 99 times out of 100, he described himself as a democratic socialist. Okay, I don't know why he chose that word in that letter. I really don't know. They're not so disparate, but all I can say is that there's vanishingly few places where he describes himself as a libertarian. So I guess he was defending the libertarian view towards censorship. I think that was perhaps why he used that word in that context, because he wanted to make sure he wasn't supporting censorship. Yes.
Just more personal question. What period of time did you know him? How old was he?
79 is when I first met him. And I met him very often after that. I wrote to him once in 78, and I said, I'm interested in reading what you wrote because I found one of his articles. And he wrote back and sent me a list of his books. And I said, no, you don't understand. I want to read everything you've written. And he said, well, I don't have a bibliography. And so I said, well, work with me. I'll make a bibliography for you. And so I went to him, and because I was already interested. I mean, in fact, he was the one who turned me into I was actually, before in the summer where I read his books, before that I was actually a student in the School of Architecture. After I read his books, actually, I went over to mathematics, and because of that, yes.
Did he ever teach at a university?
He never lectured ever to anybody. He never taught at a university. He had no post. He has several, like 5.
He's generally well educated.
Oh, he's extremely well educated. I mean, like I said, by the time he got to college, he probably knew more than most people graduating from college. And at college, he was a sponge. He would read everything. I can just tell by reading his files. He was reading everything. So I don't want to call him an autodidact, but he's in that direction.
Why did he lead a Spartan life?
Because I think like I said, he lived in Chicago during the Depression. And he just was surrounded by so much. I mean, University of Chicago was an oasis, of course, right? A lot of rich people going to Chicago, all right? But he would go out. He'd walk the streets every night, of Chicago. He never walked the streets of New York. I asked him why. He said, well, I got over that in Chicago. But the point is that, but he would go out. He would go to soup kitchens and so forth, This may have been tied in with his Christian beliefs at that time as well. Yes.
I was just going to mention in Chicago, we did cross paths with Ben Reed.
Oh, absolutely. This Ben guy was a fairly colorful person, and he actually would come occasionally and give lectures, guest lectures in some of the classes Gardner took. And so he saw him as a lecturer, but he would also follow Ben out to these socialist meetings, because Ben was a full-blown socialist, and he would go to the socialist meetings, and he would say it was kind of sad, these people were not very, they weren't going anywhere. Their movement wasn't doing anything, and so he found it kind of sad to attend their meetings. But he was influenced by Ben in the sense that Ben encouraged him to go out into the community and see the poor people. So to that extent, Ben influenced him, but not his economic philosophies.
Could you tell us something about his naval service? I know my father served 4 years in the Navy and said later that was the high point of his life. So I think that, service like that might have had a real influence in some way.
Okay, I've given a talk about this too, as you might imagine. In 1940, he wrote a letter saying he was a conscientious objector, leave him alone. But this was before Kessler's book. After he read Kessler's book, he wasn't so sure anymore about anything. So he started looking at everything again. And then about 6 or 8 months later, he wrote a letter saying, for heaven's sakes, induct me. Okay? So he did. He tried to get inducted. The Army wouldn't take him because he was scrawny. Very scrawny because of his austere life. I mean, he weighed like, 100 pounds. Okay? So he was scrawny, and the Army wouldn't take him. But the Navy was okay with it. So the Navy took him. In the meantime, actually, before he got inducted to the Navy, he tried to fulfill his service by being a shiplofter. There's very few people who even know what a shiplofter is. You can go home and look it up. All right. Now, and it's not the shoplifter, it's shiplofter. All right. And he took courses on shiplofting and thought that's what he was going to do until the Navy took him. So when the Navy took him, they found out he could type, and so they made him into a yeoman. And at first he went to, spent a year or so at Wisconsin at the radio school, where they were training radio people because they needed people who could type. And so he spent a year and a half in Wisconsin. He actually edited the magazine there, which I now have a complete set of, the Badger Navy News. And so he wrote that while he was there. He also was involved in magic while he was there. But the point is that he eventually got called up for active duty. He was on the destroyer escort, the Hope, USS Hope. USS Hope is very famous because that is the U.S. destroyer that captured the submarine, U-505, right. So it captured U-505 a month before he joined it. So even though the ship is quite famous, he wasn't there at the time. And no one on the ship talked to him about it because it was hush-hush. So he knew something had happened, but he was unclear on the details. But he spent the next year and a half at sea. He saw ships next to him blowing out of the sea. And so it was dangerous duty, being a destroyer escort at that time. He did not see the world. In fact, the only time he ever left the United States was when they stopped at port in Manchester, England. It's the only time he was outside the United States in his life. And so that's it. He was a yeoman on the ship, of course, and he had night watches, and he claims that during the night watches when he wrote a lot of his fiction.